So I'm going to speak about something that's, really a big interest to me. That's fake news and open data. This is not research. So I was asked to speak on a practice note. So I'm really speaking about something based on my experience over the last year. So on the screen, I have a cartoon that came up on my Facebook wall. And it's got two dogs. One dog's got a Confederate flag, assuming he's dumb and racist. And he says, "I'll take a bullet for my country." And the one with the nursing hat says, you won't even take a needle for your neighbors, sit down. So it's obviously has something to do with vaccination and the safety around vaccination. So underneath this post were a list of names, some really big names. Some Nobel Prize winner. One of the person, Luc Montagnier, is he identified HIV. Robert Malone is one of the inventors of mRNA technology. And what this post was trying to say is that here's a list of people who are anti-COVID vaccine. So we should be careful of COVID vaccine too. But then I looked at all these names and I started searching on Google for all these names, and I won't go through all of them for you because we don't have time, but that one name in particular stood out, and that was Dr. Kary Mullis. He's said to be the Nobel Prize winner, inventor of the PCR, and PCR is what we use to test for COVID. So I searched for him on Google, and sure enough, the first thing that comes on him is he's an inventor of method used to test for COVID-19. And then he says, didn't say. It just says something is wrong with what he did or he didn't say. And something else that stood out for me is on the red circle there. He died on the 7th of August, 2019. When did we find out about COVID? Like December 2019 at the earliest, right? I mean, China started getting worried about COVID at December 2019. I didn't even really think about COVID until 2020. And of course, 2020, it hit us really hard. So, but they said that he was anti-COVID vaccine. We didn't even think about COVID vaccine, never mind COVID in August 2019. So of course, this is fake news and fake articles trying to tell us that COVID vaccine is bad for you, right? And so there's been fake news happening all around this COVID pandemic. And I've got really deep interest around this. So my name is Kanshu Rajaratnam. I'm at the Stellenbosch School for Data Science and Computational Thinking. And what I want to talk to you is, how do we kind of overcome that? It's a very difficult thing to overcome because people have something called anchoring behavior. They believe in something and they look for data to prove what they behave in. And this is well studied in economics, but it's also true in other spheres of life. So what we saw during the pandemic was, proliferation of fake news, proliferation of irresponsible science. And of course, suddenly you had YouTube studied epidemiologists and data scientists coming out and giving us analysis of data, right? So not only we saw a pandemic of the coronavirus, but we also saw a pandemic of disinformation. And what this did was it had massive impact on policies, such as the health policies around vaccination, etc. And South Africa still remains very lowly vaccinated as a result of many people, learned people, believing whether vaccines are wrong based on wrong data. I think it's okay to believe vaccines are, let's say, bad based on the correct data, but many people believe it based on the wrong data. So I think one way to overcome that is to open data and open data analytics or analytics skills related to data, and what is the role of government and tertiary education providers in this space. Okay, so what is open data? Open data is freely available without copyright or control and freely shared and used. And the only thing that you need to do is to attribute from the user side to the person who actually put up the data. The person who puts up the data doesn't have to really say their name, but of course, in good practice, you do want them to attribute themselves so that you know how to trace back the data, right? And it fulfills regulatory requirements such as POPI, GDPR, LGPD, etc. And it's got privacy preserving. So I can't go and identify people based on that data that's out there. And it's got the same ethos and open access software or open science, etc. We've used free software before. We need to be able to get our data up there as well, right? So this is what happened with my frustration in 2020. So I had just joined Stellenbosch University. I cannot speak Afrikaans, but Netwerk 24 approached me to write some articles, right? Ek kan nie praat nie. And what I did was I wrote a series of articles in English, and Netfact24 would translate it, and they had put it up on their website. And what I was doing some basic analysis around COVID data that I had got, right? So here's some things that we saw about in the early preliminary data that we saw was that, the prevalence of COVID disease in prevalence of various comorbidities in South Africa. We know we have a high proportion of people with HIV, even higher with hypertension, lots of people with diabetes, active TB, et cetera, et cetera. And we also knew that comorbidities, people with comorbidity had a higher fatality rate than without comorbidities. So we wanted to analyze that data, right? And here's some of the early analysis of that data. If you look at hypertension, if the 22% of the people had, I think, hypertension, and 9.3% of them, 22% of the people who had hypertension had fatalities, right? And if you didn't have hypertension, then it was 9.3%, right? So I'm looking at the first two graphs there. And then the blue line says, what is the comorbidity if you had no underlying conditions? And it was much lower, just under 5% at that time, right? It's much lower now, but at that time, we didn't know how to deal with COVID. So of course, if you look at the gray line and the blue line, it tells you the gray line includes people who did not have, let's say, that particular disease, let's say hypertension, but they might have had other comorbidities like HIV, diabetes, etc. That's why it's higher than the blue line, right? So the next thing to know was, well, of course, it does seem like if you had multiple diseases, you had a higher fatality rate than if you had only one comorbidity. Sorry, if you had multiple comorbidity versus one comorbidity. So if you looked at hospital admissions, only 31% of the people had zero comorbidities, 33% had one, and 36% had greater than or equal to two. And out of those people, the fatality rates was much higher among people who had more than two comorbidities, right? But that doesn't tell you much. What you really want to know is what combination of comorbidities is really bad, right? Maybe having HIV and diabetes isn't so bad as much as hypertension and diabetes, because HIV is being managed quite well in South Africa, at least in most instances. So you want to know what are the various combinations that was really bad, because ultimately people make trade-off decisions, right? Should I go into work or not? And if I'm not, if I have some certain combination of comorbidities that could result in me dying, I'm probably not going to go into work, right? So I drew this graph, which looks at the impact of combination of comorbidities. And this graph was beautiful, right? And you're right, you see nothing. And the reason why you see nothing is because we couldn't get the data to look at what is the impact of combination of comorbidities in South Africa. You'd think this is essential data that should be shared to everyone, especially data scientists, but we could not get it anywhere because private companies was keeping it close to their heart, and so was government entities keeping it close to their heart. We had emailed the Western Cape provincial government and we got nothing, right? They were also busy, to be fair on them, because this was at the peak of the pandemic. But we were trying to get some data to spread the information so that people can manage themselves better than without any knowledge. So how do we overcome that? And that's really what I said through open data. And we have lots of examples of good open data practice. What is the benefits of open data? There is great benefit for researchers. So people like me who need access to data, but who don't have the time or the ways to access some of those data. So I'm not a clinician, so I can't go and get COVID-19 data quite easily. But if the right responsible people put it up, then I can go and analyze that data. And very often the clinicians are not data scientists, so they don't necessarily analyze that data. Well, what I was doing was basic data analytics, but if you want to do heavier data science, they wouldn't be able to do it. And it also meant that if people put up their data, then I don't have to go and replicate their data by doing more experiments or doing other clinical studies, right? So it saves a lot of time. And it also fosters greater collaborations because I'm dependent then on the clinicians to put up the data, and the clinicians are dependent on me to analyze the data. For governments, open data provides greater transparencies, because if they put up the data, then everybody knows what's happening in government, because lots of people go and analyze that data. And it also is potential for grassroots activities to form their own strategy. Because what happens is, say you're a grassroots activist in Kailicha and you need data on, let's say, poverty, well, then you have to go and collect the data. And that's quite expensive. But if government or the rightful people put up the data, then they can focus on poverty rather than collecting data, right? And then it also allows communities very often to take ownership of strategies within their communities. And for NPOs and NGOs, then they can work on their core business rather than trying to, collect data, because collecting data is quite expensive, particularly things like economic data, or anytime you have to go to a large group of people, it can be very expensive. And of course, with private industry, you could foster greater innovation because they will have some access to data. There is some difficulties with that, because what you don't want is, you don't want people to put up data and then other people to go and commercialize that data quite quickly and leave out a large part of the population. But there are great examples of how people have overcome that, right? So historically, what's happened, especially with health data, is Africa was seen as a source of data, but not of science. So people from the global north would come and get Ebola data from Africa, but they wouldn't involve the African scientists in analyzing the data. And all the glory goes to the scientists from the north and not from Africa. But that's not true anymore, right? We've seen how good our scientists are, particularly during COVID-19. We know we had some of the leading researchers in the world, actually, right? And there was been a call from African scientists, even back in 2018, way before COVID-19, for more control of our own genomic data, so we can analyze the data here and we can, take part in understanding the issues that are related to Africa. So, but what we really needed was, at that time, infrastructure to handle large data sets. We did not have that necessarily quite easily. There was a greater call for involvement of African scientists in managing our data, and of course, ethical clearance locally, rather than ethical clearance in Europe for those people, for those researchers to come and get the data here, right? So things were already changing in 2018, and now infrastructure has gotten a lot cheaper, right, than it was back in 2018. So we can handle large data better, right? And we saw some great benefits of open data, right? So, they sequenced a novel coronavirus quite quickly in China, and they put it up. The next generation sequences, or NGS, produced large amount of data. It was all shared. And once it was shared, then people can start looking at how to solve the pandemic issues. And as a result, you saw a greater number of preprints or articles, journal articles coming out quicker than we had seen historically. And there was an urgency, particularly among clinicians, to get the information out there, because the pandemic was reaching every part of the world. And I don't know if you guys have gone to this website, www.worldofmeters.info. Everybody knows about it. Everybody goes there to see what's the latest, infection rates in South Africa, or death fatality rates. And they've been great, because that data wasn't easily accessible prior to somebody like Worldometer coming and make it accessible to all of us. And suddenly we can see whether, it's rising, infections are rising or not, right? At least at a country level. But what does this mean for African scientists, right? First of all, I talked about infrastructures getting cheaper, but it's not cheap yet. We do need government involvement in setting up this infrastructure. We also need greater education in terms of open data and analytics of open data. And we need to be able to collaborate better, because what happens now is, and you see this in universities all the time, you collect data, you make sure you keep it close to your heart, because you want to, publish the heck out of that thing, and you don't want anyone else to publish it before you do, right? But also, after I've published the heck out of it, many people are not willing to share the data even after that, even though they have no more ideas on how to analyze this data, because data is gold. So we try to keep it close to our heart as possible, and it doesn't benefit society if one does that. So one has got to change the cultural mindset of how we hold on to data and how we attribute data. So for example, if I put up data on some open data platform and somebody else goes and uses it, I can be attributed in that work, right? And therefore, and we see examples like that, especially in chemistry, where people put up data online and then they get attributed in multiple papers because people use that data. And of course, we need to know how to leverage all of what we have to collaborate better and to do things better. And we are not doing that at the moment, right? Because we are not we're trying to keep everything in-house. So even us need a mind change, right? Um, I went to look at examples of open data that's already happening. And Cape Town City has access to data. Well, they have access to data from demography to transportation. You know, the idea is if you look at fuel and the fuel usage, etc., there might be greater investments into fuel, greater economic development. They see open data as a public good, so they have put up data. But then I went and looked at the website where they have put up the data. If you look at the website, and I'm putting it over here, the last time they updated something was 14th of December 2021. Before that was 9th of the 9th, 2021, and before that was June of 2020. So it's all good to have open data, but one has got to update it, etc. I presume they did not update this because it takes time and manpower to update it. There's a cost associated with it. So one has to put some effort in keeping up open data up to date. Otherwise, it is really of very little use. Right? My belief is libraries, particularly university libraries, should be enablers of open data, right? Many of you are here from universities. How often do you keep your data to yourself? And libraries don't necessarily curate all that data. Libraries have historically curated and held on to information for ages, right? And changing over to data is not a big effort for them. They're able to do that, and they're good at also partnering with each other. Because if I want a book from CPUT, I don't have to drive to CPUT or to UJ. From Stellenbosch University, they will get the book for me, and I could read it. So they are very good at collaborating. And university libraries have something else other libraries don't have, and that is access to people, specialist people in data analytics and data science, etc. Right? And they can give support to infrastructure quite easily because they do have these massive infrastructure that are interconnected already. Right? They're very good at research data management. Every big university's library has a research data management policy, and this is just would be an addition to that. And university libraries, I know at UCT, where I worked for 9 years, and at Stellenbosch University, they do train and support researchers. So this would just be another additional training on doing an analytics for researchers. But there is skills gap, and Foster Open Science from EU said, what we do not have is how to advise on open data. We need to have ways of supporting our researchers. At the moment, we leave researchers to figure out how to do analytics themselves. And I think, to be honest, that is quite dangerous, because if you know a little bit of something, you can use it very wrongly. We saw that in 2008 with finance, where people who did not understand mortgage-backed securities were dealing with mortgage-backed securities, and then the financial system collapsed, and all the economies were affected. They need to give advice on, there was a skill gap in data mining to develop metadata schemas, and I think that doesn't happen very often. And when you don't develop metadata schemas, then the data becomes harder to use because people can't then identify what is the definitions of each of the data, right? And of course, each disciplines might have its own standards and practice. And this is why libraries are quite useful in doing this, because libraries can collaborate across universities. And we know in South Africa that we have great universities, and different universities are good at different things. And so you don't want, for example, Stellenbosch University to be specializing in every data related issues with every single subject, but rather at some subjects, while UCT, UJ, CPUT, DUT, etc., do it in subjects that they are good at. And libraries do that already in some sense, because some books are found at some universities while other books are found in other universities, and they can share quite easily, right? But partnership is key, right? Within universities and between universities, because if UCT holds on to some data, and if I don't have access to it, then what am I going to do? I'm going to replicate that work, and whose money am I going to be using? Essentially, it tends to come from government, right? Most of our money comes through subsidies from government, and so it's a waste of resource. We need to partner with governments, because government, and I put it as plural because it's got to be multiple governments. So there's got to be a government, international policies on open data, because we've got to be able to transfer data where possible, or if we cannot transfer data across countries, as somebody said in the previous discussion, then have the infrastructure to be able to analyze data without data ever leaving the country. And that's already very possible. So we had written up an NIH grant with MIT and Harvard and 3 universities in Africa, where we were collecting health data, but we could analyze data without the data ever leaving the country, but just finally in a summary format or in a graph format on what we actually needed. So the infrastructure is there, but we need somebody overall to come and then, to encourage us to put it together. Let me say that way. And it's important to partner with NGOs and NPOs. Like I said earlier, NGOs and especially NGOs, they don't have much money. And what happens is you want them to then use this data to be able to analyze to better the communities where they serve. And of course, private entities, I did mention them earlier. So I've got, I think, 2, and of course with data schools, institutes, and centers. So I know we have great data schools in South Africa. We have one at Stellenbosch University. There's a center that's opened up at UJ. There's one at SPU, among all the others. And I think there's got to be greater collaborations, because these data centers, schools, institutes, and centers understand data and understand open data and can advise in setting up this open data system, right? So let me just tell you a bit about a school for data science and computational thinking. This is my second last slide. We will launch in July 2019 with a vision to be a world-class institution for data science and computational thinking and for Africa. We are very small. We have 10 researchers and 10 postdocs. We'll grow it a little bit this year. We have only 3 professors there: Brian Ganson, Bruce Watson, and most of you should have heard about Tulio de Oliveira. He's the person who sequenced the Omicron virus and announced it to the world. And then, of course, we got all those visa bans across from Europe, etc. But he did the right thing, because the data was already open, right? If he hadn't announced it, somebody else would have announced it, and then nobody would have trusted South African science. So he did an absolute great thing. And in fact, he was voted Nature's top 10 researchers who shaped science in 2021. The school's got 2 B-rated researchers at the moment, and Tulio de Oliveira, who's a Nature's top 10. And then somebody like Edwin Wilkinson, who's a senior lecturer, has already published articles in Nature and Science. And for those of you in academia, to publish in Nature and Science is kind of an amazing thing. I've never published in Nature or Science. Right. So anyway, my final remarks, right? So we need open data to help with our emergent issues. And we are going to get future emergent issues, whether it's in health or medicine or somewhere else, or agri-science, right? And when they do emerge, they come and hit you fast. So unless we get the culture of open data in, we are going to struggle in future. And library service and higher education institutions need to be in the forefront of this for all the various reasons I mentioned earlier. We need to think about storage, computation, data curation. And given our resource gap in Africa, we need to partner and collaborate better, because if we don't, because we don't all hold enough resources to do this by ourselves, right? We need to partner with governments, researchers, HEIs, etc., and also then help grassroots organizations to access and ingest this data and to analyze the data so they can do what they do best, to help communities. And of course, organizations like NEMISA have a massive role to play, but they have the role to play in identifying and helping people analyze this data, because there is a skill gap in data analytics at the moment. With that, I'm going to stop there. I spoke very fast, but thank you so much for listening to me.